President and CEO at the United Way of Greater Knoxville, and it's an honor to have so many people joining us today in this great conversation, important conversation. We're pleased that you are a part of this. Couple quick housekeeping measures, and then we're going to kick this off. First of all, I want to recognize Holly Holloway and her company, Holloway Event Co. Holloway Event Co. has put a ton of time and effort into preparing for this event, setting up this platform for the United Way, and much more importantly for our entire community to have this conversation. And so I really want to recognize Holly and her team for their great work. And if you are new to this platform, I think you will find it's got some great elements, great components. It'll be very engaging and interactive, and it'll give you a lot of opportunity to get connected, stay connected, and then hopefully in the future continue this journey on this path that we're starting today. So thank you to Holly and her team at Holloway Event Co. This is the great conversation, but we've subtitled it an uncomfortable but necessary series. And as our role here at what we're calling the Modern United Way, we feel like we're in a unique position to convene key leaders, experts in our field, and connect them with people in our community to really move the needle, transform our community, design solutions to our community's greatest challenges. And without question, one of our community's greatest challenges, and I dare say our country's greatest challenges, is diversity, equity, inclusion, and racial injustice that we have seen over the last several months. And I have had a wonderful journey myself with a couple of our speakers today who have really shared their hearts and their vision and have really become strong voices during this movement. The folks that we have today are outstanding leaders that have been in the industry, in the work, in the sector for a long time, doing incredible work. And I think you'll be excited to hear about that. And our role as a United Way is we want to make sure that their platform is amplified and that we are able to have what we are titling an uncomfortable conversation about a necessary issue in a safe place. And I really want to highlight that, is that while we're highlighting the term uncomfortable, I think at the United Way, we believe that growth comes with discomfort. And so allowing ourselves to become a little uncomfortable, look inward, address those issues, and grow from that is really where we want to go moving forward. And I'm really proud that our YLS, our Youth Leadership Society at the United Way, is really taking on this charge. And for the last several months, I've had the opportunity to sit in with their leadership and hear their hearts and their passion for this topic about what can we do, what can we learn, how can we take a journey as a group, as a community, and how do we have this conversation? And I'm really proud that they have set this up and are moving forward. And without further ado, I want to introduce the chairperson of the YLS, and that is Kayla Smith. Please welcome Kayla.
Hi, thank you so much, Matt, for that great introduction and for really setting the stage for today's event. I am so excited to be here with each of you as we tackle this very important topic, and I really commend you for taking the time out of your schedules to join us. This is one of 4 great conversation series that we're going to be hosting in the coming weeks. The next one is October the 15th, so be sure to save the date for that. Before we dive into today's program, I'd like to share a little bit about the Young Leaders Society, or YLS, and what we do. So United Way Knoxville brings together the resources to improve the lives of people in our community by helping them achieve their potential for self-sufficiency. They have 111 programs and 51 partner agencies that focus on health, education, and financial stability, which are really the building blocks for a good life. So you as viewers can help to fulfill our mission by becoming a member of the Young Leaders Society. This is open to anyone who makes a donation, no matter what the amount is, to United Way of Greater Knoxville, and between the ages of 21 and 45. YLS members are invited to participate in networking events, service projects, and exclusive presentations from our area's top corporate leaders. And it's also a way for us to serve together to be a catalyst for change in the Knoxville community. So today, we are really here to simply provide the platform for this conversation to happen, and are really looking forward to hearing from our speakers, LaKenya Middlebrook and Phyllis Nichols, during today's program. I want to take a moment to thank our YLS steering committee members for helping this come together. Especially, again, another shout out for Holly Holloway and the Holloway Event Company for helping to facilitate and produce this series. We really appreciate you all investing your time and talents for today's events. We thought that this conversation and series is so important, and we wanted to make sure that everyone had access to participate. So there is no fee for today's event. However, we do think it's important to give back to our community partners that are facilitating change and bringing justice to the racial inequities that exist in our community. So if you like what you hear and you feel inclined to give, we ask that you donate today to the Knoxville Area Urban League. There's going to be a link on the platform, and you can click that and it'll take you directly to their donation page. During today's program, there's also going to be a time for some Q&A. So make sure you type your questions into that box. And if you see a question that you really like, you can upvote it. You can click on it to rise it to the top. Okay, without further ado, let's get to the program. So I have the sincere pleasure of introducing our first speaker today, LaKenya Middlebrook. LaKenya is a native of Knoxville and a proud graduate of Austin East High School, and earned a Bachelor of Arts in History from the University of Kentucky and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Tennessee College of Law. She was admitted to the bar in Tennessee and practiced law in Knoxville. Additionally, LaKenya has developed and directed programs in the nonprofit sector and provided coaching and cultural awareness in the private sector. She believes strongly in civic engagement and has served in various capacities on local, state, and national campaigns. She was the National African American Faith Outreach Organizer for Senator Bernie Sanders' 2016 presidential campaign, the Upper East Tennessee Regional Organizer for Craig Fitzhugh for governor, and chairperson of the Knox County Democratic Party. LaKenya has spent most of her life engaging in serving her community and believes in advocating for the underserved. She has developed and directed youth, young adult, and senior citizen programs, served as a youth and young adult ministry leader, a praise dance coordinator, tutor, and mentor. Presently, she serves on the board of directors of For Girl Talk, Inc., the United Way of Greater Knoxville Community Engagement and Mobilization Committee, and the Knox County Foster Care Review Board. She's also active in the Knoxville branch of the NAACP and the Alliance of Doctoral Women. Recently, LaKenya was appointed to serve as the executive director of the City of Knoxville Police Advisory Review Committee, and she is most of all a proud daughter, sister, and aunt. So welcome, LaKenya. We are so excited to have you with us today.
Thank you, Kayla, for that introduction, and thank you to the United Way Young Leaders Society for hosting this series, and to each of you participating for believing that these conversations are necessary, and for being willing to open yourselves up to a very important and potentially difficult dialogue. And so I want to express my sincerest gratitude to, again, United Way and to YLS for putting this on, and for each of you for taking your time out to participate and be a part of this series. I'm especially honored to share the stage today with Mrs. Phyllis Nichols, who is a powerhouse in our community and far beyond our community. Her standing National Urban League is tremendous, and she is so well respected, and we really, really are grateful and appreciate the work that she and her team at the Knoxville Area Urban League are doing in our community. And I hope that you will find a way to connect to that work and support that work. I was very honored to be a part of the Young Professionals for many years and serve on the Community Empowerment Committee. As much as I would like to think that I'm still young, my age suggests otherwise. And so I appreciate the opportunity to work with Mrs. Nichols and the work that they do with the Urban League, and encourage each of you all to find your way to plug into that work. So I have been tasked with talking with you for a few minutes about the racial history of Knoxville. And I'll be honest and say that I've kind of struggled a bit with how to approach the discussion. As Kayla mentioned, my background is in history, but most of my study was not focused on Knoxville specifically. I am a first-generation Knoxvillian. My family comes originally from West Tennessee and Central Alabama. And my father is a civil rights activist, so I grew up learning and hearing mostly about the experiences of Black folks in West and Middle Tennessee, in Alabama, and Georgia, Mississippi, and Virginia. And infused in that were stories about historical experiences of folks in Knoxville. It was really fortunate to hear and grow with the leadership and guidance of folks like Mr. Avon Rollins, who is no longer with us, Mr. Robert Booker, who was the director of the Beck Cultural Exchange Center for many years and is a noted historian of Black history here in Knoxville, Mr. Theodis Robinson, and everyday folks who lived and grew here in Knoxville and had their own lived experiences. But growing up here, of course, I have my own lived experiences of being Black in Knoxville. And I'm old enough now that many of those experiences apparently now count as history. So here we are. But it's always necessary to say that Black people are not monolithic. Like everyone else, we have a range of ideas and beliefs and values and experiences. So it's important in any effort to discuss racial dynamics in communities and or the lived experiences of those that make up those communities that we are able to navigate both the general and the specific. So, not everything applies to everybody. However, there are some things that we can glean from the larger lived experiences. So I always want to point that out in beginning discussions around race specifically, that we should not look at people as monolithic, but we should also look for trends and patterns in behavior. When I think about the history of our country with regards to race, one of the underlying kind of almost foundational concepts that settles in me is the idea of place, right? What I kind of think of as place. And that's the understanding that everyone has a place. And that from the founding of our nation, it was essentially white men who were the determiners of everyone's place. And all of our structures and systems were designed and implemented in a way that would support folks staying in whatever their designated place was. So this idea has intersectional application too. So it's not solely about race. It was gender, it's nationality, it's ethnicity, it's religion, it's economics. And even still, we talk quite a bit about intersectionality and how that impacts our abilities to navigate particular spaces. I think it's important to say that we've come a long way in dismantling these ideas, but the impact of centuries of systemic oppression are still felt and manifest themselves daily in our communities. So ensuring that everyone stayed in their place kind of manifested itself differently in communities across the country. And with regards to racial dynamics, our points of reference are often places like Alabama or Mississippi or Georgia or Louisiana or some parts of Virginia, where there were, in South Carolina, where there were horrific acts of violence and oppression and suppression that were on full display. And it was, consistent and present, and it's kind of a lingering circumstance in those communities. And when the examples that we are most familiar with are rise to that level of egregiousness, it often causes us to classify communities like Knoxville, where the racial dynamics did not consistently rise to those levels, as having very good race relations, right? And that is something, if you study the history of Knoxville, you see over and over and over again where people, especially when the conversation focuses on making shifts or changes or advancements, the conversation often centers around, well, we don't need that because things are good in our community. We have good relationships with our Black people or good relationships with our white people, and we don't want to disrupt that or upset that. And so you tend to see that focus. But based on my study and my lived experiences and my understanding, which is still developing, of the Black experience in Knoxville, I would absolutely agree that the levels of violence and overt oppression that existed in many parts of the country, especially in the Deep South, did not exist here. But I believe to a large extent it didn't exist here because it was not as necessary, right? And part of what I mean by that is that, so when we look back at the founding of Knoxville was founded in 1791, I'm sorry. The total listed population of Knoxville at that time was 3,619, and 173 of those were enslaved people. There were also, they listed out young white men, older white men, white women, and then enslaved. And then there was a category that says other, which was about 66. So it's possible that there were also some free Black people in that number. We're just not sure. But there were 163 enslaved people at the founding of Knoxville. By the time you get to 1795, which is just 4 years after the official founding, there were 2,365 enslaved Black people and 100 free Black people in Knoxville. You fast forward a few years to 1860, and the number of free Blacks had risen to 423, while the number of enslaved had increased by only about 5 to 2,370, right? And so during much of that period, while you had enslaved people here in our communities and free Black people here in our community, they tended to only represent usually somewhere less than a quarter of the total population. And we see throughout the history of Knoxville, right, where the Black population may rise to somewhere between 18 to 22%, and sometimes as low as the mid-teens in terms of the Black population of Knoxville. So you didn't see communities, where you have really large plantations that had hundreds of slaves on one property, and so you have really large numbers of Black population in these communities. And as you start to move toward emancipation, even before you get to emancipation, but especially as you start to move toward emancipation and Reconstruction, there becomes a real tension because Black folks represent a large portion of the population. That just wasn't the case here in the Knoxville community, right? So like I said, Black folks typically represented somewhere at max, usually around a quarter or a little bit less of the population. And so there wasn't as much of a need to have these really overt actions of oppression to keep Black folks kind of in their place, right? Because there wasn't as significant of a population to have a significant impact in terms of politics, in terms of city power, in terms of earning power, et cetera. And also with that, because we had enslaved people, but we didn't have very many large farms or plantations. A lot of times these were small family farms, or they were industrial type businesses for blacksmithing or shoemaking, things like that, where enslaved people were working alongside of white people. Enslaved people in this area, several of them could read and write, right? Because it was beneficial if you are leasing one of your persons out for carpentry or blacksmithing, for them to be able to read and write, and make sure that the person you're leasing them to isn't cheating you when they're sending their money. And so it was beneficial in that regard. But as we start to move toward emancipation, again, we have almost immediately, even I think a little bit before emancipation, but especially right immediately after emancipation, you start to see the development of an opening of Black churches in our communities. You start to see the development of Black schools, and most of those schools were housed in some of these church buildings. And some of these institutions still exist in our community. So for example, the Warner Tabernacle Church, which is now known as Greater Warner Tabernacle, it's now housed in Burlington, is the oldest Black church on record here in Knoxville, and it was actually a stop on the Underground Railroad. And so it has very, very meaningful history here in our community. And so Blacks in our community were able to start churches, to have schools where they were educated. And of course, these were segregated, as was traditional in just about every part of the South, really in a lot of parts of the country, but especially in the South. Some of it initially segregated by practice, and then of course codified in law. Especially with regards to education, that Black and white students could not be educated in the same spaces. As with many parts of the South, we see that Black men in Tennessee were first able to vote beginning in 1867. And here in Knoxville, as early as 1869, we see the first two African Americans or persons of African descent being elected to city office, right? To the kind of precursor of what is now city council. And it was structured differently. So they were elected kind of as aldermen from their wards, which were all Black because of segregated living, of course, right? And so from 1869 to about 1912, you see regularly people of color being elected to city offices and appointed to city positions as police officers, et cetera, right? But post-Reconstruction, we see a dramatic shift, and we see this across the South, and Knoxville was not different, right? And so we have Black folks beginning to be elected as early as 1869 through 1912, and then from 1912 it was I believe 1966, right, before we see a person of color elected to state office, and I think it was 1969 roundabout where we see a person of color, an African American, elected to city office again, and you know, that was not, again, inconsistent with what we see in other parts of the South. And, you know, I think it's important to note that we go from 1912 to 1969 before we see another Black person elected to city council. It was 2017 before we had women of color elected to city council, and 2019 before we had a person of color win an at-large seat. So we are still, as late as 2019, we are still doing first for people of color in our community. So, you know, we think educationally, of course, as I said, Black folks were developing schools and building schools as we start to move more toward public education, because at this point, education was mostly focused around private education. There wasn't a public education system. So as we start to move toward public education, we see the complete segregation of schools. And it was a pretty consistent battle where folks in Knoxville were able to, you know, build schools, and sometimes it was a battle. We had to get a lot of funding from outside sources, but if that funding was available, you tended to see elected officials be amenable to opening schools. And like I said, sometimes there was some push and some battle around that, but it was able to be done. But again, those schools were completely segregated. There were always challenges around the equity and equality of facilities, of resources, of curriculum, and access to needed resources for students of color in our communities. And then, of course, with the 1954 Brown versus Board decision, We see quite a bit of resistance in the Knoxville community to desegregating schools, right? So the Brown versus Board decision comes down in 1954, and the infamous language of all deliberate speed is interpreted by communities in a lot of different ways. And what you see is this consistent back and forth, right? This push by groups like NAACP through legal action to force desegregation of our schools. And there's consistent pushback. And it wasn't until 1973, so the decision comes down in 1954, it wasn't until 1973 that that the Knoxville City Schools implements its desegregation plan, right? And so you begin to see, and how that tends to manifest itself is you have mergers of schools, which a lot of times results in white flight, right? So for example, I'm a graduate of Austin East High School, and I know that there are some other graduates of Austin East High School who are watching right now, so go Runners. But Austin East High School was the merger of the Black high school, Austin, with the white high school in that area east. And what you saw was when those schools merged, essentially all of the white students left. And so it was still a de facto segregated school. Moving forward, even into the 1990s, we still saw a significant amount of segregation in our school systems. And that's because we have segregated living situations, right? Most of our neighborhoods are segregated. And I'll talk very briefly about that in a minute. But into the 1990s, I know I was the listed plaintiff in a lawsuit in the early 90s with regards to school desegregation and the implementation of a plan to desegregate schools. And so in the early 1990s, I was bused to school outside of my neighborhood in an effort to better integrate Knox County schools, right? And the way in which that plan was implemented, and the way in which you often see desegregation plans implemented in our communities, and this is, of course, speaking from the perspective of a Black person in this community. What that decision said to me was, in order for you to get the education that you need, we are going to send you somewhere else, right? So integration often looks like taking minorities out of their community and putting them into majority communities, right? You don't often see there actually being an exchange or an occurrence. And what that said to me as an 11-year-old kid, a 10-year-old kid turning 11, is that the rest of society believes that that which is in my community, which I value, does not have value. And that resonated with me and has really helped to shape how I see and understand the world around me and the society around me. But one of the biggest impacts on the Black community here that I do want to touch on briefly was urban renewal. And I'm sure that many of you all maybe have heard of urban renewal. I encourage you to visit the Beck Center and really learn and study urban renewal here in our community, right? So urban renewal was a plan that was federally funded plan that began its implementation in about 1958 and went through the mid 70s. I think it was about 1975. And the result was the displacement of homes, businesses, religious institutions in our community. So the Black business and home community in Knoxville, from essentially post-emancipation up until about the mid-1970s, was on the east end, the edge of the east end of what we now know as downtown Knoxville. So Central, Vine, State Street, all of that, a good bit of that were Black homes, businesses, churches, institutions. There were theaters, there was a library, there were recreational institutions and activities. And urban renewal came through with the goal of improving transportation, accessibility, and replacing blighted property with actual usable facilities, and essentially decimated that community. There were blighted properties there. There were properties in disrepair, but as has been tradition for Black communities, because we are limited in where we can live, work, and play, all of our communities tend to be mixed income communities. So just like there were blighted communities there were thriving, blighted properties, there were thriving properties. And there are people alive today who can walk you to the spot where their family home used to be, where the Coliseum now stands, or where the interstate runs through. And it had a significant impact on the economic feasibility of the Black community here in Knoxville. So Bob Booker, in one of his books, kind of lays out what was lost. And there was something like 21 restaurants that were displaced, barbershops, beauty salons, 9 grocery stores, taxi cab companies, pool halls, churches that were displaced. And some of those were able to relocate and continue to be successful. But many of those owners, when they were surveyed later, said that they were just not able, either they were not able to really relocate because the money was not sufficient to get property somewhere else. And the same thing with homeowners. Or when they did reopen, their business declined significantly, which greatly impacts the ability to create generational wealth, right? If I don't have my business anymore, I can't pass it down to my child. If I don't have my home anymore, I can't pass it down to my child. I can't loan against it. And so you saw a significant decrease in businesses and the social viability of Black Knoxville with urban renewal. And we're still feeling those impacts today. I will highlight one more thing. Knoxville was a Red Summer site. So if you're familiar with the Red Summer of 1919, Knoxville was one of those sites, and there's an effort by the Beck Cultural Exchange Center to exonerate Maurice Mays, who was kind of the flashpoint for the violence that we saw. We still don't know how many people died in that experience. There were race riots here where a white mob came into a Black community. But there's an effort by the Beck Center to exonerate Maurice Mays, and so I would encourage you to look into that and to sign that petition if you are able to. As I close, I will give a few recommendations and then we can take some questions. I would strongly encourage you to visit the Beck Center, the Beck Cultural Exchange Center on Dandridge Avenue, and they will be able to go into extensive history of the Black experience in Knoxville. And you can actually see, they have some visuals of the community before urban renewal and the community after urban renewal that really lay out what was taken. Robert Booker has written several books. One of them is an encyclopedia, experiences of Black people in Knoxville, Tennessee. And he's also written a fictional book that's based on the Red Summer incident that I would encourage you to read. I also suggest Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. It's not specific to Knoxville, but it's written by Martin Luther King. And if you read some of his discussion of the experiences of Black folks, especially the economic experience, it's eerily similar to where we still are now. And then, of course, many of you probably have read, and if you have not, I would suggest The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, which talks a lot about redlining, exclusionary zoning, restrictive covenants, and how that impacts the ability of Black and brown people in our country to close the wealth gap and build generational wealth. So thank you, guys, and I'll be happy to entertain questions.
Thank you so much, LaKenya. The comments are coming through and everyone is just giving you rave reviews, and I don't know about everybody else, but I've taken so many notes and have learned a lot, and really appreciate you sharing your life experiences and just all your wealth of knowledge of the history in Knoxville. We do have a couple of questions, so we'll go through those. The first one is, why was there such a large gap between the first and then the more recent Black Knoxvillians elected to office in 1912 to the 1960s?
Yeah, so a big part of that had to do with, so after coming out of Reconstruction, on the federal and then, of course, state levels too, mostly on state levels, you saw implementation of significant voter restrictions like laws and policies, and some of them were codified by law. Some of them were more just kind of standard practice. And then two, so it became more difficult in a lot of places for Black folks to vote, right? And then two, you saw shifts in how the city government was organized, right? So initially you were elected from your ward, and then there was a shift to kind of slightly similar to how we have our elections now. So now it's kind of a mix of you running your district and then you have to run citywide, right? But there was a period where it was like everybody ran citywide. And in a citywide election, even if you have a Black person running, then if the Black population is only, at best 20% of the population, it makes it very difficult for a Black person to get elected. So there were situations where Black folks were really critical in determining the outcome of races where white people were running, but they weren't a large enough voting bloc to actually elect Black representatives that white people were not willing to vote for. And so that was a major piece of it. So part of it was voter restrictions and the ability of Black folks to vote, and then part of it was a change in the political structure that made it difficult for Black folks to get elected.
Thanks. Okay, next question. Are you aware of any current efforts to analyze and notate the financial losses for specific families affected by urban renewal in Knoxville?
Oh, that's a great question. And I am not. That does not mean that those efforts are not being conducted. I think a great resource for knowing if that's something that's happened may also be the Beck Center, because the study of urban renewal is a central focus of theirs. But at this point, I'm not aware of any efforts to kind of assess the actual dollar loss by individual families or individuals. But that's a great question.
This is a great question. This one is a question I think we're all asking ourselves. It says, LaKenya, assuming you're using some notes from your presentation today, would it be possible to get a copy of your notes and or references?
Yes.
Okay, we'll be sure to send that out. Okay, we have time for one final question. And I'm sorry, these are jumping around. How can we equip, where did it go? How can the Black community equip more African American members to run for a political position?
Another excellent question. I think that, that's a really good question. So I think that part of it begins with engagement, early engagement first. So you first and foremost have to make sure that folks understand how the political system and participation in it actually impacts them. Because there are a lot of folks who feel like, I vote and I show up and folks have been voting for years and nothing in our community has improved or changed. And so it's important first and foremost for folks to understand that they have a role to play. And then I think mentoring, so for folks who are already engaged, whether they are already elected officials or folks like me who have worked in political processes, that's something that I am really passionate about, is preparing and training up young people, or not even just young people, folks who are interested, period, and finding ways to plug them in, because folks did that for me. And so it's really important for me to find ways to plug those folks in. And then, it's really hard running for office. And so we have to make sure that if we are going to ask people to run, that first and foremost, they understand what they are running for and what those positions do. And also that they are going to have a network to support them, because we can say we need more Black folks to run, but if we're not going to help them raise money, we're not going to help them find staffing, we're not going to help them coordinate volunteers, then it's really hard to ask people to do that. And the reality of the situation is most Black folks in our community don't have political connections because there's just not a lot of Black folks who've been elected, right? And so they don't have a lot of ties politically. They don't have a lot of ties financially. And a lot of times their networks are pretty limited. And those are the things that most connect people to political participation.
Well, LaKenya, once again, thank you so much. This was just such a privilege to hear you talk and just to share all of your great insight into this extremely important topic. We are going to break up into small groups now, and so don't go anywhere. We've got some pre-populated questions that are going to be in the chat box for you to go through with your small groups and have some really good thought-provoking conversations, and then we will gather back here and hear Phyllis Nichols. Thank you.